Hello, everybody. Thanks again for joining us here. My name is Jay Pipes. I'm a principal open source engineer on the EKS team, and I'm going to ask a few questions about open source collaboration in the continuous delivery and GitOps space of these guys. But before I do that, I did want to make a quick shout out. So as Alexis referred to earlier, there are some folks who made a lot of effort on the Argo Flux project, and I'd like to mention their names. So from Weaveworks, Hide Bedals, Fonza Costa, and Stefan Prodan were instrumental in this collaboration. I'm going to totally...
And Michael Bridgen.
And Michael Bridgen, absolutely. I'm going to totally screw up names here, but Jesse Suan, Saradi Srigiri Raju, and Alex Machushantsev were all critical in the Intuit side. So thank you very much to all of them. Please, round of applause for them. Thank you. So Bob, I wanted to ask, why is AWS even involved in this? Why were you really pushing for us to contribute and participate in this continuous delivery and GitOps space, and in particular, why Argo CD and Flux CD?
Right. So I think you heard a bunch of my comments, I'm sure, from the talk. This is really an outworking of that customer obsession we have at AWS, and starting to observe that we had customers who were kind of starting with Kubernetes and wanting to adopt it for the right reasons. But really, we felt like it was important for us to really engage in helping those customers take the steps that they needed in order to actually succeed. You don't want to have a customer start with Kubernetes thinking that they're going to get a big velocity improvement and then realize 6 months later, oh, we really needed to be worrying about CD and CI and observability and all of these things that you need to do in order to be successful. And so that's really the main motivation for us to be so involved in this.
Yeah, I mean, it's from just my short time at AWS, I've gotten a chance to just see the breadth of different types of customers at AWS. And we've got greenfield folks, we've got brownfield folks as far as folks that have a lot of legacy workloads that are moving to a more sort of container native ecosystem. One of the things that I'm really excited about with Argo Flux is that Flux CD and Argo CD sort of address different market segments. And Pratik, Intuit's a great example of one of those sort of brownfield, legacy enterprise IT companies that wasn't exactly container native from day one, right? I mean, so what are some of the challenges that Argo CD was trying to address, particularly about the enterprise IT space and continuous delivery?
Yeah. Am I active again?
Yeah, you're good.
Okay, good. So I think the big thing to understand is that when you talk about brownfield, this is taking an institution that is 35 years old.
Can you speak up?
Oh, sorry. This is better. I'm saying it'd be easier to think about an institution that is about 35 years old and lot of brownfield and legacy environments. We actually have Pascal still running in production, just so you believe. But the goal here, is really that in order to achieve this kind of transformation, you're talking about a technological transformation, an organizational transformation, a cultural transformation, right? So the journey is essentially about, for Intuit, for example, over the last year and a half, we moved away from an SRE-centric organization into a completely DevOps-centric organization, meaning we no longer have SREs, right? So the development teams are essentially running and maintaining their services. And as we started doing that, we recognized that we needed to provide developers with a much more sophisticated set of tools to actually manage their environment so that they could actually operate these environments. So in order to achieve this transformation, you need to have tools which will enable them to deploy without understanding the environment that it's running on, without understanding that they needed to go and provision EC2 instances or databases, right? So that's kind of where Argo CD came in. Is as we were working towards achieving the transformation, we recognize that there is actually a need to also develop these tool sets that would enable and make life easier for the development community as well.
Alexis, describe some of the differences that you see, the major differences that you see in the user experience of Flux CD versus Argo CD, and maybe describe a little bit about how the Argo Flux sort of joint effort, how we're pushing towards a sort of aligned user experience.
So, well, let me start by talking about Flux, and then I'll try and address your second question.
Great.
So, Flux was created at Weaveworks to deploy clusters, applications, and services in a way that we thought was the right way, meaning that we wrote it as an opinionated tool based on our opinions about how to deploy things. And throughout its development, we've tried to keep to that set of opinions. And the people that use it and love it are the people who share that opinion. That doesn't mean everybody. It's a reflection of how we work. And so Flux's difference with Argo CD, I would say principal one, is that it's a much more opinionated tool than Argo CD, which means that if you compare the users of the two projects, you'll see that the Argo CD community, by and large, is more like Intuit. They sort of tend to be slightly larger companies with more different systems where, Flux's opinionated nature would be fine in, let's say, 50, 70, 80% of the cases, but there's enough around the side that you need to integrate with that you might want to use, say, Argo workflows to do or something else. And therefore, it's a sort of, Pratik likes to think of it as addressing more an enterprise set of concerns. And Flux is definitely oriented more towards the get me started quickly and make my deployments easy as fast as possible set of concerns. So the question then becomes, can we make it possible to do both of those things in the future with a single tool? And I am not an engineer and should not be trusted to answer this question. However, I will try. But I believe, I used to work on something called Spring. And one of the nice things about Spring, or Spring, the second generation Spring Boot, is you start with an opinionated experience, which is weakly opinionated, meaning that it's very easy to override as you discover that the opinions are not ones you agree with. So instead of saying, I'm opinionated, and if you don't agree with my opinions, you can go away, you say, I'm opinionated, which means you can get started quickly, but here's all the ways that you can adapt me if it turns out that your environment is different from the environment of the people who gave you the software. And that is one way that you can introduce choice after an initial easy user experience. Now, ultimately, however, the decision will be made by the community. This is a collaborative effort, could involve anyone in this room, anyone watching this live stream, anyone watching this in the future, I hope, in the distant future.
Yeah, and the GitOps engine is a source repository under the Argo project, where we've been doing much of the work around aligning Flux CD and Argo CD.
Yes.
So there's some links. There's also some Birds of a Feather session tonight where we can go over the work that's been done in the GitOps engine and where that collaboration's been happening. There's a number of GitHub issues that describe design requirements and that kind of thing. So we're definitely looking for your feedback in that. I'll just ask each of you, what do you think are the biggest obstacles to innovation in this space right now? One thing that I've noticed is that stateless applications are typically used as sort of like the demoable type things around continuous delivery. Do you think that stateful application management and doing actual clean rollbacks of stateful applications is something that sort of like can next be addressed by progressive delivery and GitOps operators like Argo Flux? Yeah.
Yes, so this is actually a recurring theme at Intuit, right? The whole stateful versus stateless apps. Being in the SaaS space, right? So all of our products actually are updated, upgraded, deployed very, very frequently. Being in the consumer space, what we find is that we are typically running a lot of experiments, right? A lot of experiments to figure out, the different modes, what we get out of the different experiments we're running, and essentially which ones work better. Right? So that's a big difference from the traditional canary or A/B deployment, right? We want to run hundreds of experiments at a time, and we want to be able to figure out very quickly which one is working faster. So this is where the notion of progressive delivery becomes more important, because the whole idea of progressive delivery, and we actually do not think about it as progressive delivery. We actually think about it as an experimentation engine, right? So in the sense of how fast you want to run these things. So that, I think, in essence, what we are looking at is that'll be the next phase of deployment strategies and delivery strategies.
Yeah,
Shall I answer the question?
Yeah, what do you think are the obstacles?
The obstacles.
The obstacles right now that the continuous delivery space presents, and how we're going to overcome those things. Not to put you on the spot.
I think actually that the most interesting challenge right now that we need to take on is, let's say I do an update to EKS, and I'm rolling out a new application change, dashboard change, service configuration, all doing GitOps. I can do that easily today now. Now, you can go and try it for yourselves. It is super straightforward, and it's transactional and safe. And then, of course, people say, well, okay, that's great, but I'm also updating my Lambda function. And because I have a sort of somewhat arcane operational legacy, and I'm using Lambda to glue together changes to my new app with updates to my legacy operational environment. I just have the function sending things off. And when I make a change to the app, I'm introducing a couple of new operational processes as well, and I want that to be part of my transactional update. So I think we need to capture how that works for functions, and obviously for other similar types of services before we start grappling with dealing with versioning of state. And that's partly because actually a lot of the problems that you run into in terms of state management, we know all the workarounds for already. Like, don't mess around with state, treat it separately is a good rule of thumb. But getting functions integrated into the total deployment of things inside Kubernetes would be a wonderful thing to do.
Bob?
Two things. I think one a little bit more on the cluster side. One of the conversations that we have with customers all the time is about how immutable should we think of a cluster itself as being. And this kind of expresses itself as a debate in some respects about, should I have a big, large cluster that I upgrade, or should I have multiple small clusters? And clearly the answer here is going to be to have an opinionated approach, that if you disagree with the opinion. In fact, in this case, I agree with Alexis' opinion on this. But still, even if you want to treat a cluster as this sort of immutable thing, maybe you can think of the version of the cluster as being immutable. But there's still things about that cluster, perhaps like how many nodes are in it at any given time, that aren't immutable. And so I think like just trying to puzzle our way through
a brand new 1,000-node cluster is not the same as just
Correct. But you still, I think, want ways to bring up the new cluster in the new way and have the old cluster and migrate workloads from one to the other as part of your deployment practice. So that's one thing. On the data front, there's an interesting thing that we see customers doing, especially in the ML space, that I think is the symptom of this crying need for more formal kind of approach to data management, which is the need to do a repeatable experiment, and what we see customers doing is actually packaging the data itself into the container and then deploying the container and running it. And this is like 8 gig containers, 10 gig containers, like massive containers with the experiment data packaged inside the container. If people are taking that approach to things, it just shows that there's a pretty big gap for us to cross in terms of how do we actually provide a kind of community-accepted way to manage those kinds of.
It's a great opportunity for Amazon to provide a new data storage service for people doing machine learning testing that can support millions of different models and versions, yes.
I would say we have those today. Actually, a bunch of different choices. What we haven't done yet is we haven't assembled those services that we have into Kubernetes-friendly way to actually do things like deployments and integrate them with Flux and Argo. So I think we need to connect. I think we have all the pieces there. We just need to connect the bits.
So the last thing I'd like to talk about is the contributor processes and communities for Argo CD and Flux CD. They're both very different. Obviously, the history of Flux CD and Argo CD are very different. How are you planning on aligning those two contributor communities and making sure that we get the feedback of the user communities from both Flux and Argo as we go forward?
Can I, before these guys talk, I want to jump in on this,
Please
just
do, Bob.
because there's a couple of ways to do these kinds of project merges. One way is to completely have it figured out in advance and kind of launch it as a done thing. That generally doesn't work in open source communities very well, and so like we had a bunch of discussions about this, and I think this is important in open source projects generally, and it's hard to put something out there that isn't perfect and isn't right, but it's also really important to get everybody's help in getting it right, and that's what we're trying to do here. So anyway, with that.
Shall I go first? You want to go first?
We can go first.
So, yes, first of all, there are a number of meetups this week where you, if you wish to contribute, can come along and discuss this with maintainers and contributors from the projects today and hear about the current plans, bringing things together. Please, 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 please do that. There is also a Slack channel. Please hang out on the Slack channel. For the iterative processes in open source to work at all, we need to have total transparency on the record. That works extremely well for encouraging people to work together and has been essential in the process up to now as well. So that's the first two things I would say. A little bit about trying to second guess the process. I would say that both Intuit and Weaveworks are an opinionated group as individual teams and treasured that during the early stages of the creation of these technologies. And so when I asked the Flux team in Weaveworks if they could move to more of a community-based way of working as a first step towards going into the CNCF, that was something we had to work to do. It took a bit of time. We set up weekly meetups, started working in a different way on the Slack channels, started working with external contributors, and gradually opened up the project. So when we applied for membership of the CNCF, we were ready. And the Argo, I think, is going through a similar process. And I think as those processes happen, it becomes then much easier to achieve the consolidated governance that we aim for. But as a goal, it needs to be something which is participatory, not exclusive.
Yeah, I think the thing that we should look at is where these projects started from, right? So both Flux and Argo CD have actually been transparently run and operated in the open source community, right? So when we created Argo, we actually followed the CNCF open source mechanisms, right? So we had the regular repo structures. We used the same, contributor license agreements, both individual and corporate, and essentially created a community based on that, and then let it grow organically, right? And as we looked at, combining these two projects, we also approach it the same way, right? We essentially first got the contributors, the core contributors together, and essentially let them hash it out, right? And was it pretty? No. I think Alexis and I remember sitting outside, kind of twiddling our thumbs while the developers sat in a conference room and initially hashed out what this would be like, right? And, eventually, from time to time, we'd poke our heads in there. We could see Jay struggling, to maintain composure. But eventually, something emerged, right? The teams actually came out of it feeling that, one, there was actually something that was valuable here that needed to be, driven forward. Secondly, their biggest concerns actually, were not about their particular contributions, but more about the community, right? So they were essentially coming back and saying, how's the community going to take this? How are we going to explain this to the community? And that is why the process that we have, launched and the process that we're moving forward is not a process which is done yet, right? It's actually going to happen in full transparency over the next few months, and with participation from everyone, right? So I think that's the way to do it.
I'd like to add something to that. Great point. If you're in the audience or watching this and you're thinking, I'm a large corporation, a bit like Intuit, and I'd like to do an open source project because I think open source is important to how we work. And I want my developers to think about that. The key thing is it's a lifelong commitment. The project is something you need to keep nurturing for as long as the project is useful. It's not something where you say, throw it over the wall, to exaggerate a little, and say, hey, look, we made this thing, we gave it an open source license. Everyone can use it. We are now heroes of the community. That never works. It never works because actually the thing that's most important is the lifelong commitment for the length of the project of the people and the processes around it. Really, 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 really important. And we have that commitment with these projects.
I'd like to actually add something about that because we see this a lot at Intuit, right? Everyone now wants to create an open source project, right? And so the way we've really structured the process is to say, first, create an open contribution process within Intuit. So the first step in doing this is to really open all of the repos within Intuit so that anyone can contribute. How do you do that? You actually start following the same guidelines that you would for an open source project, but now do it internally, right? So same Git repo structures, same README files, same contributor model, maintainer model, a committer model, right? And as you start doing this, people get more familiar with how do you run an open source project. And then essentially you start figuring out, okay, you have an idea for an open source project. Let's figure out, one, is there something available outside? Have you ever looked at it? Because you can't just start something that is not available outside. Have you started actually thinking about contributing to a project that's outside? And if there's a no on both sides, then you say, okay, let's figure out if you want to create a new open source project. And we let them do it, and then we essentially figure out what the graduation criteria is in terms of the commitment that we have to that project, right? Because it takes a lot of energy to create communities, to nurture them, and to keep them moving. Right?
Yeah, I know just from working with these guys over the last 3 months, their level of commitment to their user communities is intense. And I'm sure that going forward with Argo Flux and the merging and combination of those communities, their top priorities is making sure that the user communities from both Flux and Argo CD are happy with the way things go forward and are given an opportunity to provide feedback and shape the way of the future for Argo Flux and Argo Flagger and all the good stuff that's coming up.
Do we have questions?
Say again?
Do we have questions from people?
Do we want to do
Are the audience going to do this? We've got 10
I
minutes.
suppose we could do a couple questions from the audience if anyone has them. Not everyone at once. Hold on. Yes?
How does Terraform fit in all this?
The question is, how does Terraform fit into all this? Maybe Alexis, you would like to talk about this, since Terraform was mentioned in the original GitOps blog posts.
Yes, I would be ecstatic to answer that question.
Good, I'm glad you are.
Okay, so I'm going to brave the
One might also say, how would CloudFormation fit into this as well?
One might say that, if one worked at Amazon.
If one were to, yeah.
So we can have a talk stack, Terraform, Argo, Lambda, Kubernetes, and that would be an entire GitOps stack. What is Terraform doing in that? It's doing the provisioning of the machine layer, the infrastructure. What is Kubernetes doing in that? It's doing the provisioning of the clusters informed by some of the technologies I showed in my bit earlier. Argo and the tooling in that chain, Flux, Flagger, et cetera, is managing applications, services, meshes, experiments, and who knows what we'll find out in the future. And this has got to be integrated with functions. So Terraform is a layer of the GitOps stack. More specifically, I mentioned in my bit something called EKS control, the controller for running EKS using GitOps. Now, when we talk to people about EKS control, we get two responses, by and large. One of them is, this looks great, I'm going to use it. The other one is, we've committed to using Terraform for everything, how can I fit them together? And the answer, if you love using Terraform for provisioning everything, is that we need to change EKS control to be a Terraform provider. So then you can do it all from Terraform in that, if you, and be happy, because you're a Terraform person. So that's the integration point, and then EKS control, at least from a Weaveworks perspective, is a GitOps cluster management solution, and then up you go up the stack from there. So that is how Terraform fits into the story.
It's one driver for convergence.
I'll add a comment to there, which is we have two groups of users. Those who will not touch it if it doesn't have Terraform support, and those who won't touch it if it doesn't have CloudFormation support. And both of those groups are really important. We consider, from the EKS perspective, we consider CloudFormation and Terraform to both be first-class citizens. And in fact, we consider EKS control also as one of those kind of three things that we consider to be first-class citizens and really important to different portions of our user base. So you have to be able to get ops with all three of those technologies.
Yeah, it's interesting because that's something that I did not touch on. But when I showed the demo about creating clusters, right, what you don't see is creating the AWS resources and the AWS services. So for example, our users usually want to create a database. They want to have an RDS instance at the back end. They want to have their clusters created, right? And we actually do use CloudFormation, right, to create the clusters and the services. What we don't have is a similar orchestration engine, which will essentially sync and create, and essentially mirror. So today, for example, we have a service internally, which we haven't open sourced yet. We are in the process of open sourcing, which will provide a similar mechanism, but for resources, for AWS resources. So the ability being that you can check in your CloudFormation template into Git, and you will have an orchestrator that will now essentially take that, run it, essentially execute it, and then keep it in sync, or at least notify you when things go haywire, right? So that is something that we do have internally, we do use internally. And if there's a need, definitely come see us. We have a booth here. There's actually a lot of talks that we're doing on some of these topics. So search your KubeCon app for Intuit, and you'll see a lot of them there.
Jay, you should
talk
plug
later
AWS.
about the AWS service operator.
That's
with Michael.
Which is what we use.
yeah. There you go.
Anyway, I think we're almost out of town here. Is there any other questions from anyone? Yes, please go ahead.
Many financial companies have compliance that require, when you deploy to the product, they require auditability that require like 2 human how do you handle that?
So the question is, many companies have compliance and auditing requirements. How do you handle those kinds of policy and audit requirements?
I'll be super quick so that he can answer too. On Wednesday afternoon, I'm doing a talk with Fidelity about this. We have an EKS-based solution, which we've built together, so please come to that. You can also introduce human policy checks if you want to during the process of deployment. That's something that both our tools, I believe, support. And finally, every time you do anything where it's recorded in Git, you have an audit trail.
Right.
And we have customers who've been through SOC 2 compliance based just on the Git audit trail.
Yeah, as I mentioned, we are a financial services company, so compliance is one of the first things that we look at. If you notice that in some of the demos that I did, there was actually an audit tab, which I never clicked on, right? Because it actually has a lot of proprietary information. But the audit tab is really where we monitor for each deployment, each service, each cluster, what's going on, who touched it, and then for each service or namespace, who are the approvers. If you also noticed our build pipeline, that actually has manual approvers in each steps for compliance and governance reasons.
I'll add one more thing here, which is auditors are getting comfortable now with the fact that robots are better at doing audits than humans. And if you are putting humans in the middle of your audit process, you have a much higher chance of actually not doing the check the right way or not actually taking the right activity. And having fully automated versions of all this is actually way better. That is a chat like that does require work to get everyone over the hump on that. But it turns out the reason you get people over the hump on it is it's actually better. That is not to say that you don't need the humans involved. It's just that you need the humans involved at the front end of the process before the train starts rolling and let the robots take care of the rest. Now, I understand that's an ideal in some, for a lot of people, that's going to feel like an ideal world. But really, if you want your audits and security to be better, that's the best way to do it. And you can get there. Companies are getting there on this point. So, yep.
All right. I think we're just going to wrap up now.
Right.
I just want to say thank you very much,
you.
everyone, for
Yep.
coming. And please provide feedback. Thank you.